Humanities at University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I'm here today in collaboration with Dr. Lexi Webster, who is the Deputy Director of Digital Humanities here at Southampton. So I just walked around from the same hallway here to the room today. It's very nice. So today I'm going to talk to you about activating queer archives, imaginative listening, and sound making in practice. And most of my research is really centered at the intersection of cultural sound studies and media labor and production practices. And in particular, I'm interested in the way that those two areas of study can help us better understand how queer and feminist politics is translated and produced into media across different decades. Broad scope, most of my research is engaging with this particular question. What can we learn about our techno-political present by tuning our ears to the past? What is it about shifts in media technology and politics that got us to where we are now with what some would argue in Western societies as a predominance of queer representation, whether we still need improvements or not, it depends on who you talk to. And how did we get to this point of thinking about a content saturation rather than a content lack? So over the past 5 years, I've been doing a deep dive into radio archives in particular and doing an intergenerational study of how lesbian feminism and queer feminism manifests in sound media. So from 1970s radio, particularly this case study in Canada. So this is where I was doing a lot of my research. I'm a recent one to the other side of the ocean. And this was looking at 1970 radio shows like The Lesbian Show out of Vancouver, Canada, which was on air from 1979 until about 2016, and Dykes on Mics out of Montreal, Canada, which was on air from the mid-1980s until about 2014. And what I was doing was digging through the archives of these materials, as well as listening back to them with contemporary queer and feminist media producers today. So I myself am a media producer, that's my trained background. And so we were listening back, me and other podcast producers who are interested in how we translate our politics into production, in particular into sound, when a politic of queer and feminist activism is often tied to visibility. What does it mean to bring our politics into a politic of audibility? And for this, I've been developing what myself and other sound culture theorists think of as an ear-oriented political phenomenology. What does it mean when we think about political orientations? So what does it mean to be oriented toward certain objects, of course, and visible material goods? But what does it mean to be oriented toward what is ephemeral, such as sound? What does that mean when we're thinking about queerness as both an identity and a method in the way that queer theorists and researchers are thinking about queerness as both an identity marker and a way to think through our orientation to our research? And for me, what does it mean to engage in a feminist embodied ear? What does it mean to listen with feminist ears? So thinking about the sonic possibilities of critical listening to create sonic possible worlds. And this idea of possibility is really central to what we think about when we're thinking about what is queer feminist politic and media production. It's really thinking about how do you make a sonic possible world. And I'm drawing here on scholars such as Jennifer Lynn Stover, Sonic Colorline, which is a study of race and cultural politics of listening, Listening Publics, Kate Lacey, Hungry Listening, which is thinking about colonization and listening by Dylan Robinson, fellow Canadian scholar, as well as Queer Phenomenology from Sarah Ahmed, thinking about those queerness in queer interactions in our orientations with objects and with others, as well as a selection of theorists across sound cultures and feminist media studies. To apply this idea of a feminist embodied ear, and apologies, I just smacked your microphone a little bit. I'm doing a few different approaches to applying a feminist embodied ear. One way is I keep audio diaries as part of my research method with all of the work that I do. And that breaks down into diary components. So I do entries before and after each interview I conduct, as well as during key event entry moments. So when I'm going to the archives, when I maybe come across a material that might be useful, to be able to actually listen back to my own voice rather than my translated notes. So I find field notes are a moment where I'm starting to write already in more academic language, and listening back to my own field notes from like 5 years ago in my voice actually immediately brings me back to that place. And it also embeds me into the very politic of sound that I'm interested in engaging with. I also apply my feminist embodied ear to a politics of giving back and working with the people that I am studying. So for instance, when I was doing my work on Dykes on Mics, I worked with 2 of the members of that show to dig up about 40 past tapes and recordings from that show. I digitized all of them and helped them and assisted them in donating them to the archives with a Q in Canada, which is the LGBTQ Archives of Canada. So really, what I'm thinking about here goes back to what's become a really iconic quote in queer history studies from Gail Rubin, which is, the more I explore these queer knowledges, the more I find out how much we have already forgotten, rediscovered, and promptly forgotten again. And I actually think this resonates across many of the talks today. So with a little bit of that background about how I approach research and approach listening practices, I'd like to highlight a few key terms of study that I've developed and themes and concepts that I'm planning to bring into my work in development with Dr. Lexi Webster here at Southampton. And that's what next question of what that project is we're really interested in queer media nostalgia and how we can study that across different generations of queer audiences and queer makers.
Carry on, Stacey.
It's our tea top up.
Yes, it is.
I'm just going to skip forward through these slides a little bit. Okay, so one of the shows I mentioned was Dykes on Mics, and it's one thing to talk about these shows. I think it's another thing to actually listen to some clips so you get a sense of why bringing a critical ear to listening to these works is so integral, rather than engaging solely with the textual materials within the archive. So this is a clip of Dykes on Mics that aired in 1991, July 15th. And this was the 1-year anniversary of the sex garage raids in Montreal, which was a large party raid that happened. There was a lot of police violence against the LGBTQ community. And this show was part of a larger commemoration they were doing in honor of people who were brutally beaten and jailed, and really listening back to and thinking about what that moment brought to queer activism and to Montreal at that time. So we'll hear a little bit from the hosts and a little bit of their audio collage in commemoration for the 1-year anniversary. So for me, as I'm 33 for context, someone who hasn't lived through this is the year that I was born, there's a certain familiarity in listening back to some of these clips. I immediately am taken to moments, to media, to conversations that are still happening now within the LGBTQ community. And so when I'm listening back to these particular clips with other media producers and activists, it's interesting to see what comes up for people, as well as listening back to this kind of work with the people who actually made it. So I had the opportunity to interview, for instance, Deb Van Slet, who is still a quite active media producer in Montreal, about what it meant to make this work and how heavy and political this time was, but also the way that weaved in moments and memories of joy with them, moments and memories of community. And so from Dykes on Mics, we're crossing the country to the other side, to the West Coast. At the same time, we also have The Lesbian Show taking place in Vancouver. Both of these shows are what is considered community radio in Canada, which is completely volunteer run. It is very much then activists and interested and concerned community members who are taking up the time to produce these shows. So The Lesbian Show, in contrast to Dykes on Mics, was much more of what was considered a magazine-style show, so much more like what you would hear on the radio if you're listening to public radio, where there'd be a mix of interviews and news and music. Dykes on Mics was much more conversational, and The Lesbian Show was going for more of a professional feel. As a result, they actually had a frequency. My old version of the slides, that's okay. They had a frequency that spanned outside of Vancouver city center on an FM band out to rural areas outside of the city as well. And this created a huge impact in the actual reach of this show compared to other community radio stations where the community surrounding the station would be within the city center. Now, I argue that when we're thinking about radio, we don't often associate it with activism. It's often thought of as a neutral form, as a form of information communication, rather than anything artistic or activist. But here, I really position these radio shows within a larger audibility activism movement. And for me, I define audibility activism as the intentional use of sound to promote or intervene in socio-political, economic, or environmental issues toward a perceived better world. As a sonic counterpart to visibility politics, we can understand the politics of audibility as a set of debates and ideologies about how power is formed and enacted through sound and listening. So I position radio shows and podcasts within this political realm as a media counterpart to, say, being involved with the Dyke March and the chants and sounds of those types of spaces. In my research over the past few years into audibility activism, particularly within the media space, there's a few key themes and contributions that have emerged that I really think need to be revived and brought forward into the way that we're thinking about how politics and media intersect. There needs to be an interest and engagement with sonic identity and intersubjectivity beyond the visibility politic of representation. We need to be thinking about community reciprocity, centering safety. Something that radio does that other media don't do very well is the ephemerality and utilitarianism of the radio creates a safety for listeners that we don't have in our data age. So, for instance, if we're thinking back to listening to a radio show, if you're sitting in your car listening to the radio, you could be listening to anything. Unless you're blasting it or your car is covered in Katie Lang stickers, no one's going to guess you're listening to queer radio. Whereas if I am listening to podcasts or I have a Netflix account and I'm consuming queer media, there's a data trail that's explicitly left of what I'm consuming that can create safety issues for people who cannot be out in their communities or families or are at risk in their own workplaces for engaging with that kind of material. Additionally, when we're thinking about radio, it gives us a different way about thinking about queer aesthetics, about intergenerational dialogue, which is very much the root of the way I'm thinking about this work, as well as those questions of discoverability and platform. What can we take from something ephemeral and free like radio and bring into the way that we engage with digital media today? And of course, play and experimentation, which was very much at the root of community-made media. So here's some examples I mentioned of radio being this real technology of safety and community. And these are some quotes from two former lesbian feminist radio hosts that I talked to, Deb, who we heard a little bit from in that clip, and Silva Tenenbein, the late Silva Tenenbein from the Lesbian Show. So Deb shared with me that I remember one kid even told me that she was so in the closet that she was literally in her bedroom closet listening to the show on the radio. This was a way of this person engaging with community, understanding and navigating their identity in a way that was much safer for them than actually entering into a physical space or carrying material goods or materials on them. We hear a similar experience from Silva, where she got a letter from a listener, and Silva says, "We started to get mail from remote places saying, 'We love your show. We live in Abbotsford. We get into a car and keep all the lights off, turn the radio on and listen to your show because we can't afford getting caught in the house.'" And now I want to take a moment here because, of course, I'm talking about radio shows that no longer exist. But radio is still very alive and well, and this politic is very alive and well in countries across the world, as well as in these debates and ideas are being taken up in the podcast space as well. While I'm not going to talk about podcasting today, I'm very happy to talk about podcasting at any point with people as one of my other main areas of research. So the what's next, when we're thinking about this intergenerationality, this politic of media that is often not brought into the conversation of representation and media and politics, here during my fellowship at Southampton, it's given me an opportunity to follow a thread of this research I have yet to be able to truly engage with, and that is the experiences of audible exclusions that I've found and really frustrations I found in digging into the archives. As we know, archives are places of power. They tell us a lot about what is considered and who is considered important to archive and keep as part of our cultural heritage. And one person I could not find in the archive for the Lesbian Show, despite my best efforts, was Danny. So Danny was an older trans lesbian woman who was a host and producer of the Lesbian Show for about 10 years, so quite a significant point of the show. And I only found out about Danny through interviewing another former member, Irene Cloma, who's a super cool musician in a really good band called Panteo, if you want recommendations. But they told me about Danny, their experience with Danny, and they say, quote, "I think the most significant part of the Lesbian Show was meeting Danny because she had also transitioned later in life. The intergenerational interaction with Danny being like an older trans woman. I was kind of like, you know, baby dyke, L-word lesbian, 21, 22, and Danny was at the time in her late 40s. And so what I'm interested in about this idea of audible exclusions is bringing forward how we might engage and grapple with those exclusions. And one way that we're starting to see take up speed in queer history as well as in archival studies at large is speculation. So what does it mean to be speculative and think about speculation as method? And this is really coming out particularly Black futurisms and Indigenous feminist futurisms, and what we're not seeing in the archives. So what can we do to then speculate and make those stories visible or audible when we aren't finding them in those archives? What would it mean to actually hear Danny in those spaces? So here we're thinking about how speculation is often born out of the necessity of the exhaustion or unsuitability of other approaches. What does it mean to dream, imagine, speculate what might have happened or might have been there if things had been otherwise? And so one space that we're already seeing this kind of speculative work take place is in popular media. So when I'm thinking about social media and the transitions from pre-internet or pre-digital media, such as radio broadcast and magazines, into our digital moment, we often will engage with this kind of work in digital space, such as an Instagram page or a podcast that is thinking about, say, in this example, queer histories, but those encounters are glitchy. There's a certain enclosure and collapse of time and reality. There's a certain aspect of nostalgia that I'm quite interested in digging more into. What does it mean to feel nostalgic for something you didn't live? So glitch here is a powerful and celebrated vehicle of refusal through which we might manifest new possibilities of being and becoming. So here I'm really, you can tell these are new ideas, thinking about speculative, speculation, and glitch in digital space as different tools that we're bringing into the way that we engage with queer histories and queer possibilities. So that brings me to the questions that Lexi and I are trying to grapple with over the next few weeks and hopefully develop into a larger exploratory grant on queer media nostalgia and imaginative listening in the archives. How do we hear queer archives? What do we imagine we will hear? How might we attend to sonic absences and silences in our digital era of archival abundance? And I look really to works such as The Images, Such as They Are, Do Have an Effect on Us by Kate McKinney and Hazel Mayer from 2022, in which these two researchers and artists actually created and used the form of archival folders and materials to tell a story. So none of these archival materials are real. They created them to fill a space and gap in a politic that was happening in Vancouver around feminist pornography and debates at the time, and circulated those materials to fellow researchers to start a conversation around those missing stories, as well as Ancestral Futures, Speculative Imaginings from the Archive, 2023. And this is a collection of work that called out and asked the question, what stories can we find in the archives of Black, Indigenous, people of color whose stories are missing, and what new creations can these archives or the gaps in them inspire? And this is a collection of speculative fiction works based on the archives that are available. So while these projects are particularly text-based, I'm interested in how we might actually make sound work that is speculative as well to fill in some of these missing audio materials. So next week, I'm running and testing out a few of these ideas in a workshop here at Southampton called Activating Queer Archives, a workshop in imaginative listening and sound making. So you're welcome to come. If you want to come, just let me know. And it's going to be hybrid, and we're going to be actually questioning and thinking through what does it mean to make speculative sound work and engage with archives in this kind of critical making practice. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stacey. Are you able to press the
Stop sharing?
screen?
You got it.